Welcome everybody to tonight's, it's the first lecture sponsored by the European Institute and its initiative for cultural studies that was funded 5 years ago with a generous matching grant. And as part of this initiative, we bring guest speakers in for classes. We have put together a curriculum in cultural studies and cultural diplomacy, and we welcome you all. My name is Victoria Phillips, and I'm with the European Institute and associated faculty with the Harriman Institute. Tonight we welcome David Robarge, who received his PhD in American history from Columbia University. After teaching at Columbia and working for banker David Rockefeller and at the Gannett Center for Media Studies at Columbia, he joined the Central Intelligence Agency in 1989 and later became a political and leadership analyst on the Middle East. Dr. Robarge moved to the CIA history staff in 1996 and was appointed chief historian of the CIA in 2005. He has published several classified works as well as unclassified monographs on the CIA's supersonic A-12, reconnaissance aircraft, and intelligence in the American Revolution. His biography of the Director of Central Intelligence, John McCone, was recently declassified. His articles and book reviews on CIA leaders, counterintelligence, covert action, and technical collection have appeared in Studies in Intelligence, Intelligence and National Security, the Journal of Intelligence History, and the Oxford Handbook of Intelligence and National Security. Dr. Robarge has taught at George Mason University, currently teaches at Georgetown University, and has also written a biography of Chief Justice John Marshall. And it gives me great personal pleasure to welcome David back to campus. He has spoken several times for us, and of course is coming back as an alumni of Columbia. And his one of his dissertation advisors is soon to be here, Herbert Sloan. So we do really welcome him back as a member of our community. We ask that you do not tape this. There will be a tape available via the European Institute, so if you would put your cell phones away and please turn them off, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be back here and to talk to you about a, I think, quite misunderstood element of what the CIA does, which is to help implement foreign policy through covert action. Basic intelligence functions of the agency are collection and analysis, and those are intended to inform foreign policy decision-making. But once a foreign policy decision is made by the president through the finding process to engage covert action as part of the foreign policy, then the CIA is called in to help implement that policy. And this leads us often into very tricky political waters, because oftentimes those policies that we are asked, ordered to help implement are not very solid policies. Sometimes they are not well thought out, they're not given time to work, they are done in a crisis mode, and when that happens, covert action becomes highly problematic, as you'll see not just from my introductory remarks, but from case studies that I'll present in the course of my remarks. So that's why it is, as I say here, indispensable. Every president, regardless of party, political ideology, foreign policy perspective, eventually, if not right at the start of an administration, comes around to using covert action to assist it in achieving its national security objectives. But for some of the reasons I've already outlined and others you'll hear later, this often becomes highly controversial. Whether the program succeeds or not, sometimes it sort of runs against the grain of American values, or it leads to unintended consequences or unexpected outcomes. And therein lies oftentimes a lot of political difficulty for the agency. Let me start with kind of very basic information about covert action. What exactly is it, and why does the CIA do it? To understand covert action, you have to distinguish it from espionage. Espionage is intended to be secret through and through. You do not want an adversary to know that you have recruited a source, that that source is stealing secrets, that those secrets are getting passed to you, and that they are informing your foreign policy decision making. So secret all the way through when it comes to espionage. And indeed, sometimes the information our spies collect is so sensitive that we can't act on it because it would disclose the fact that we have a source on the inside or some technical collection capability that we want to protect. Covert action is different in the sense that it is a hybrid of secret and open. It is secret in the sense that we don't want the adversary to know who is behind the activities that are causing the changes in the political environment of that target country. Those are obvious. Things are happening that weren't happening before. And insurgency is suddenly more vibrant. A political party is able to run a robust campaign. New messages are getting out through various media, that kind of thing. You can see it's happening. But who's doing it? Is it some country? Is it some set of non-governmental organizations or private actors? Or is it the US government? That's where the covertness comes in. So as you can see from the official definition here, influence or change is inherent in covert action. You want to go into a country and have it different than when you started your covert program. You want whatever is going on in that country to be more closely aligned with US foreign policy interests. But the key to the covertness is that the US government will not be acknowledged publicly as the actor behind those changes. So understand that distinction there between an entirely secret operation and one that is only partly cloaked to protect the fact that the US government is the influencer behind the scenes. Covert action can be categorized in roughly 4 parts, and we've done them all in varying proportions and, as you'll see, with varying degrees of success. The propaganda is what we convey through various media, things like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, through planted stories in foreign media, through using agents of influence who are trying to steer public discourse in certain areas. Political action involves usually secret subsidies to political actors, members of political parties, labor unions, student groups, agricultural cooperatives, actors like that inside the target countries whom we want to be able to use for shared purposes. And I would underscore that as a dynamic in covert action. This is not the blatant, callous, cynical manipulation of innocent and unwitting actors in a foreign policy environment. Yes, of course, in some of the organizations that we use to implement covert action, you do not declare who you are. So many people in those political entities I just mentioned are unwitting of CIA involvement. But generally, some in those organizations know about us. They are the ones we have approached, we have recruited, if you want to say that. We have, in effect, sold them on the idea that we have a shared interest in implementing the US foreign policy objective because it will advance the interests of their own agendas in that country that we are working in. The third type is the paramilitary. These are ones that are lethal or have the potential for violence. This runs a gamut of things. This could be arming an insurgency or training a government security service to suppress an insurgency. It could be providing weapons or training to various actors in the target environment. The idea being that paramilitary activity has the potential or the actuality for some kind of violent activity. The fourth type, economic covert action, usually is a subsidiary of political action. We don't engage in economic covert action for the sole purpose of running down the price of a commodity or destabilizing a currency or sabotaging economic production facilities just for the purpose of doing that. Those are usually tied in with some broader agenda to destabilize a target government. as we did, for example, in Cuba during the 1960s. So economic is, some scholars say, not really a standalone, but rather a tactic used to advance a more strategic political interest. Other scholars do break it out, and so I bring that to your attention here. One thing to keep in mind is that effective covert action is often tied in with overt policy initiatives. That is, they are complementary. And indeed, the most effective covert action works sort of hand in glove with the overt policy of our government. But we do want to recognize that even though you have this synergy, certain things that the US government does are in no way directly related to covert action, such as basic diplomatic efforts or military assistance programs or the other things that are listed up here. They might be working in parallel to advance the ultimate foreign policy interest of the US government, but they have to be distinguished from that. The previous slide provides you with the legal definition of covert action, and also I would underscore the fact that legally the only entity of the US government that is able to conduct covert action as defined by law is the Central Intelligence Agency, unless the President decrees otherwise, and he has that authority in Executive Order 12333. So, just by way of illustrating this, when US Special Forces engage in what sure looks like spooky commando-like activity, and the CIA's ground branch is doing much the same thing, they're doing it under different legal authorities. Title 10 for the military, Title 50 for the Central Intelligence Agency. Looking at many hundreds of covert actions that I have had access to at the agency, I'm able to discern a whole variety of big trends and also to present some secrets to success if you want to make sure that a covert action is going to be effective. And I'll also show you in a little bit how many covert actions the US government has officially acknowledged and released loads of documentation about, so you students and scholars out there have lots of grist for writing analytic research papers or even books, and I encourage you to tap into that very deep well of information. And I'll also explain to you why it is not a skewed sample set. We're not just throwing out the best of the best. Often we're putting out the worst of the worst. So it gives you a broad range of successes and failures, non-controversial and controversial programs that you can write about. Now, as indicated up here, a few misconceptions arise about CIA covert action. The assumption, for example, that it is pretty much the bulk of what we do, that we are really the covert intelligence agency rather than the central one. This is understandable because since 9/11, the agency has had a very large proportion, of course I can't tell you how much, of its resources devoted to counterterrorism under covert action authorities. Historically, however, the covert action resources have ebbed and flowed like a sine curve. And if you take that reality of this up and down, and you stretch across it a timeline of world events and US domestic political events, you can very much understand right away why covert action is a big part of our budget under certain administrations at certain times in our history, and why at other times in our history it is a relatively small proportion, based again on world events and domestic political issues. One reason for that is eventually covert actions become overt. It's inevitable, particularly paramilitary ones, because when you start blowing things up and shooting at people, it's pretty easy to figure out who might have an interest in subsidizing an entity that is suddenly doing that. When these programs become acknowledged or overt or leaked, then oftentimes political controversy ensues. And particularly when the programs are failures or seem to be failing, that leads to all sorts of political activity. denunciations of the agency, efforts to cut back on the budget, lots of public controversy. And if you think just of the 1970s, when many covert actions were exposed by the Church Committee, you can see how suddenly this is fueling the fire of a broader controversy at that time about the legitimacy of U.S. intelligence broadly. As a result of those controversies, you have much more scrutiny given to covert action than ever before. Back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, Congress really didn't oversee much. It was more overlook. Do you have enough money? And don't tell me what you're going to use it for, because then I have to answer a lot of questions. And we were able to work in that political environment relatively effectively for about 25 years. Then with the exposures and scandals of the 70s, the whole oversight environment changed radically and forever. The House standing committees were set up, in the Senate and the House rather. You have the requirement that the president put his name on an authorization document called a finding. No longer can the president say, well, that was something cooked up in the NSC, I really didn't know about it. His name is on it. And you also have requirements that the agency inform the Congress within a relatively short period of time, roughly 48 hours, and that it be a full and complete finding information. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? That's all for the classified record of the oversight committees. Covert action in general is, as I mentioned, one of our most misunderstood enterprises. A lot of people think it's relatively easy to carry out, that you can move into a country and establish the covert action infrastructure, recruit the assets, get the plumbing all laid on very quickly. Presidents have often had this misconception, and that's what leads a number of covert actions to fail, because they are done on short notice without proper strategizing and without the proper capability to implement them in these countries. Academics have had similar misconceptions, journalists have, and I think to some degree the general public, in part because of the focus on a very limited number of covert actions that were acknowledged quite early in this whole period of time in the 1970s. And for a lot of time after that, that was the only information available. And people drew a lot of misconceptions out of those. If you look at the broad set of programs that I've had access to and you have access to through the acknowledged ones, these are the basic effective techniques or approaches to use in covert action to try to make sure that you make it as successful as possible. It has to be laid in early and viewed as an overall strategy, a kind of a whole of government approach, complementing the overt policies. Sometimes in our history, however, the covert action has been somewhat askew from the overt policy, and that has led to some obvious problems later on. It also needs to be implemented early, because the later you do it in a foreign policy initiative, the more likely it is to fail. It just doesn't have time to work, and when it's invoked in a crisis mentality, it is almost assured of failure. Turned off. Is it on now? Sorry, okay. So you want to start out with that, and then when you get out into the field and begin implementing it, you want to recognize that you are changing the dynamics of the operating environment. The country you're working in is going to be different than it was before. When you're out in the field, you want to have flexibility to adapt to those changes, many of which will be unexpected and even undesirable. And if you're waiting for headquarters to micromanage you, you're going to be overtaken by events constantly. And that is going to also lead to the probability of the program failing. Another misconception about covert action is that you can, in effect, turn the battleship around very quickly. That a country that is moving in the wrong direction, you can make right by coming in with your covert operatives and manipulating people like a puppet show. This is not the way covert action works. That is a myth. Covert action is most effective when you deal with the existing civic, political, social structure, the media architecture, the political actors, and you find individuals who have a shared interest with you. You are not buying them, you are not forcing them to work for you. You are looking for a shared agenda, and a positive one, not just kick this regime out of power, but put someone in better instead, for example, if that's the foreign policy goal of the covert program. So you don't make bricks without straw and clay. You start with what you have and you amplify it. You have your allies within the country, winning over more people in the undecided middle ground, kind of like an American election. The battle is always for the undecideds and the independents in the middle. What you want to do is expand that group in the direction of your allies and pull them away from your adversaries, whoever they might be, in that operational environment. So the essential point here is covert action has to have shared interests, shared values with the actors we're using in the country, who are assisting us to achieve something that they want as well. And that leads to an important point, that you have to have locals given the prerogative to choose outcomes. You do not, though we have, regrettably at times, given the circumstances, come in and try to play kingmaker or queenmaker. What's far better to do is to establish an acceptable range of outcomes, eliminating the fringe elements, let's say in a 5 political party election, and focus on the center groups, maybe a center left, a centrist, and a center right party, assist them, and then allow the locals to choose in a free and fair election which of those they want. That provides legitimacy. It eliminates the concern that this is a made in USA outcome. It provides local buy-in, and it increases the likelihood that the outcome, which both of us desire, will last. And finally, though it's happened sometimes when we have been dropped in to an operating environment about which we know relatively little and don't have much operational experience with, you have to base your covert program on extensive knowledge of the target, an understanding of the political culture, the media infrastructure, the social dynamics, and also protect your program from penetration and disruption by practicing good counterintelligence and security measures. Regrettably, a number of our programs were penetrated or were disrupted by adversaries, and that seriously inhibited them from operating effectively, and in some cases led directly to their failure. The Bay of Pigs is a good example. Castro had infiltrated the Cuban expatriate community. He knew some kind of paramilitary activity was coming and was not surprised at all when we landed on the coast of the Bay of Pigs in April of 1961. He saw it coming, in part because of the penetration of the community that we were supporting. I won't go through these because they're just the flip side of exactly what I said, but I do want to underscore at least this point here, that when we are working against a sort of an authoritarian regime, if that regime retains a measure of popular support, whether it's through apathy or intimidation or sincere support, and maintains control of the military and security services, we will have a very difficult challenge to meet in trying to influence that government in any manner, and including removing it from power if that's ultimately the goal of the policy. Here we have a list of our acknowledged covert actions. By my count, we have acknowledged at least 50 covert actions in various forms to varying degrees. Not the same amount of documentation is available about all of these. What I would emphasize here in this sample set that is available to you through public records is that it is global in coverage. It is comprehensive in chronological span. It goes back to the earliest days of the agency up until most recently 2011. The bin Laden raid is our most recent fully acknowledged covert action. It also is a representative set of successes and failures. These are not cherry-picked success stories by any stretch. Any of you who know anything about U.S. intelligence history can identify a number of disasters up there, whether they were operational failures or hugely controversial operations. And you also have a similar proportionality in the type of covert action. So this is not skewed in favor of propaganda or political action or anything like that. In short, you have a representative set for scholarly purposes. And this also is reflective of the hundreds and hundreds of programs that remain to be acknowledged. And numerous others will be acknowledged in the coming years through, for example, the State Department's Foreign Relations of the U.S. series, which has the mandate to have released covert action documents that pertain to certain foreign policy initiatives. You also have the FOIA process, declassification of official histories, such as my McCone book, which, if you get around to reading it, I hope you'll see is a pretty objective look at a very mixed record during that period of time, 1961 to 65, including in the covert action area. This is the hardest business we get into. And it's not just because of the political controversy, it's in many ways the most complicated of our enterprises. When you think about it, recruiting assets in foreign countries is relatively simple. You spot potential assets, you assess their utility, you make connections with them and develop the relationship. At some point, you get down on bended knee and make the marriage proposal, i.e. the recruitment pitch, and then they start working for you. They pull secrets out of whatever they have access to, they give them to you, you handle them in the field, you turn them over to your successor case officer, and then at some point you end the relationship for a variety of reasons. That's relatively simple. Hard to achieve in the long run because the proportion of people you actually recruit is relatively small, but the basic process is pretty simple. When you're talking about covert action, it can be anything as simple as a letter to the editor to arming a massive insurgency. It can be as simple as writing a check to a political party or trying to support a government that is being destabilized by a foreign-supported insurgency. Covert action is everything from both ends and in the middle. And that explains why the failure rate for it is so high, over 50%. Imagine being the manufacturer of a product and half of the cars you build blow up after 2 years of use, or cell phones that catch fire, or whatever. You're going to go out of business pretty quickly. Covert action, however, persists for a variety of reasons, despite this relatively high failure rate. Now here I would throw in a complication. Measures of effectiveness. How do you know in a complicated environment that what you did, what CIA did, tipped the scales one way or the other? Especially now in the digital age of social media, how do you know that a story that you have put out through some propaganda vehicle and suddenly is broadcast all over the world is having any effect? Or did somebody else come up with the same message somewhere else, and now that's out there too, bouncing around on every social media platform? And even more important, beyond saying, yeah, I put it out, is it changing anybody's mind about whatever the foreign policy goal is? Is it winning allegiance to a political party or drawing support away from a political leader, whatever? That's always been a challenge, especially when you have relatively soft, hard to pin down the effect of propaganda programs. In a political action situation, if your goal is to win an election, you either won it or you lost. That's pretty cut and dried. If your goal is to overthrow a government, it either got overthrown or it stayed in power. But when you get into more complicated covert actions where you're trying to change attitudes and build a broader base of support for whatever your shared allies are doing, it's very hard then to say that what we did made a difference. Also, you have to keep in mind that we have adversaries who run covert action programs and are oftentimes right there next to us trying to foil us. Or they're running a parallel program they might not know about ours, but what they're doing is complicating what we're doing, inhibiting its effectiveness, complicating our ability to measure that effectiveness. And that's something that historically we have had a bit of a challenge understanding, being able to penetrate adversaries' covert action apparatuses. We've been pretty good about penetrating their espionage apparatuses, but not their covert action apparatuses, something we need to be better at. Also, an important point, notice how low a success rate we have on long-term achievement. Relatively few, by my count, less than a third of our covert action programs have stuck. The desired result has persisted over the decades. And I'll explain why in a minute. I think it has oftentimes less to do with the program itself than the foreign policy follow-up to the program. Now, with that really mixed picture of success, you might wonder, why do we do this at all? Why don't we get out of the business? And periodically we have had intelligence reformers who have said, we should. What we ought to do is turn all the propaganda over to the State Department, because everybody eventually figures out it's coming out of the US government anyway. Why not just say it right from the start? Or the paramilitary programs. Wouldn't they be more effective if the US military were running them? Then we wouldn't have to spook around in foreign countries, covertly arming insurgencies, and then getting into trouble when people reveal that we're the ones behind it. That said, that's not the reality. We are always going to have that covert action authority. And it really, the attitudes about it go all the way back to the very beginning. Harry Truman is president when CIA is founded and authorizes the agency very quickly after its founding to engage in covert action through a variety of National Security Council directives. And his perspective, as this quote suggests, is that here in the early Cold War period, and you do need to put your mind back into the late 40s, early 50s, and not think about this really in the contemporary context, that we are back at a time of global struggle for survival. A black and white world, if you will, of freedom versus tyranny, communism versus democracy. It's got to go one way or the other, and we have to mobilize our resources to protect our values. So, from Truman's standpoint, it's necessary even for national survival, not just for some kind of tactical advantage, country by country. A slightly more cynical take on covert action is expressed here in a quotation from my favorite spy novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. Control is the fictional character who represents the head of the British Foreign Intelligence Service, MI6. And what he's saying here is that if the adversary is playing rough, then you better be prepared to do much the same. Otherwise, you might as well, in effect, not even get into the ring. You can't go into a boxing match with one hand tied behind your back and jumping around on one leg. If the adversary is going to do some pretty wicked things, then you at least have to reserve the right of yourself in extreme circumstances to do some of those same things in the covert action area. Okay, back up. On the flip side of this, you have a couple of arguments. One comes from, I would call, the moral perspective. And this one has a special resonance, doesn't it, now that we're talking about Russian influence in the US elections. Now, historically, the Central Intelligence Agency, and of course I can say this because we've acknowledged this many times, has tried to influence elections. Now, back here in the early Cold War, you have one of our senior foreign policy figures, former Secretary of State Robert Lovett, saying, in effect, we should operate under the golden rule in international affairs. Don't do unto others what you would not want them to do unto you. Now, this is all very nice sounding and remains, certainly in the context of what I just mentioned, a useful and I think effective argument that why would we want to do that to them if we don't want it done to us? A harder edged perspective comes from a CIA turncoat, Philip Agee, who eventually wound up working for the Cuban intelligence service. And what he says effectively is that covert action is inherently wicked, that whatever high-toned values that it might try to be perpetuating around the world, that, let's try this one, okay, that it ultimately leads to suffering by the innocents, that the elites remain immune, that the military and the security services remain autocratic, and really all it does is incite more oppression. And I won't say that he doesn't have some examples to back up that argument. If you look at covert action in a sort of a cost accounting fashion, cost-benefit analysis, I think you have a little more pointed critique, something that really gets down to cases, if you will. And this comes from Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the court historian of the Kennedy administration, right after the Bay of Pigs, so you can understand why he might have been a bit skeptical about covert action. But look at his arguments here. They do resonate with the historical record. Most covert actions don't remain covert. They're easy to detect. Hard to control, yes. You are trying to change an operational environment, and sometimes it goes down roads that you hadn't anticipated. I wouldn't say it's always illegal, but yes, certainly somewhat immune anyway to normal measures of accountability, because as I mentioned earlier, for many, many decades, the Congress simply didn't want to know, and the public was totally unaware of most covert actions. And then very importantly, his last points here, it really doesn't make that much of a difference in the long run. You can't find many examples where covert action really threw the entire game in our favor, that it was at most of marginal advantage and in some cases worked to our detriment. In other words, it's an overrated tool of foreign policy implementation. But what it fundamentally comes down to in this somewhat witty comment by one of our former directors is that you can't always use diplomacy and you can't always use military means to achieve your objectives. You remember the quote from Winston Churchill about jaw and war. Well, we have a third option, and indeed covert action is often referred to as the third option of foreign policy implementation. You use it when the diplomats and the military simply are irrelevant. And regardless, as I said earlier, of political party, political ideology, perspective on foreign policy, every president comes around to using it eventually, and some can't wait to get started at it. Here I would contrast Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. You might be surprised to hear that President Carter signed more findings than Ronald Reagan. And in the two big programs that the Reagan administration is associated with, Nicaragua and Afghanistan, Carter signed all of the Afghan findings and two of the Nicaragua findings, the non-lethal findings providing political and propaganda assistance. Reagan signed the lethal findings authorizing military assistance to the Contra forces. However, the contrast is that Reagan started signing findings very early in his administration because he was dedicated to winning the Cold War and used CIA as an aggressive foreign policy tool led by a kindred spirit named Bill Casey, former OSS officer, who was very, very excited about the prospect of using covert action at CIA. Jimmy Carter, in contrast, as you'll see, came to office highly skeptical, even denunciatory about CIA, and he and his director, Stansfield Turner, inhibited CIA from doing covert action until well into the administration, after the takeover of Nicaragua by the Sandinistas and the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets. Then Carter suddenly starts signing findings, and nearly all of his findings were signed in the last year and a half of his administration. Two cautions, though. Don't overuse covert action. It is a very circumstantial, opportunistic tactic or technique. It's not a one-size-fits-all, use it in every foreign policy situation. As Richard Helms says here, and he was a former espionage officer before he became director, and he was pretty skeptical about covert action during peacetime. He said it has to be used surgically, like a scalpel. And if you start wielding it around like a blunt instrument, it's not only going to wear out its efficacy, but it's also going to be extremely hard to keep covert, because immediately anything you do in the foreign policy field will be presumed to have a CIA hand behind it. So you have to be very cautious about the situations in which you employ it. And another important point here, I alluded to this earlier. It goes to the question of success and failure. If you look at the range of findings that have been acknowledged over the years and covert programs in general that preceded the finding process in 1974, you'll find that a number of them deal with broad international issues that are never going to go away. Terrorism, weapons proliferation, narcotics trafficking. These are what we call global findings, and they are going to persist through the ends of our lives and well beyond. However, most covert actions are very specific in both their target country and or region and what they are intended to accomplish. And if you go find out on the internet the very small number of findings that have been declassified and released, you will see what a finding looks like. It's a broad authorization by the president to go into a certain environment and try to achieve certain foreign policy objectives that are spelled right out there on the finding. And the term finding comes from the language. I, President blank, find that in this foreign policy situation, covert action is necessary to achieve these objectives. And then you turn the page and you will find the operational plan that the CIA and the National Security Council have formulated. Usually those findings, as I said, are pretty targeted. We're going to go into this country or region to accomplish A, B, and C, and when we do that, the covert program is over. It is terminated. Or, if it seems like it's not working, or it's creating contradictory developments, then it will be canceled. But it has a definite lifespan. Now let's take a program, hypothetically, where you go into a country, you achieve your foreign policy objectives through the operational plan, and the program is terminated. It is a success. Now, who is responsible in the US government for making sure that that success persists over the years. It's not the CIA, because our authorization for covert action ends, and unless the president says, now I want you to do this in this target country, we're out of the business. We're still there, of course, conducting espionage to see what's going on, but our covert action capabilities have been pulled back. Who's responsible at that point depends on the nature of the situation, but it can be variously one or all of the above following. It can be the State Department, the National Security Council, military assistance programs, USAID, non-governmental organizations, any or all of the above, depending on the exigencies. But it's really out of CIA's hands at that point to make the covert action accomplishment persist through the years. And in a little bit, among some other case studies, I'll be showing you some examples of where the foreign policy follow-up really caused the covert action to fail over the long term, because nobody tried to make the new situation last through the years. And that's where I would say in certain cases like Guatemala and Iran and the Congo and some other examples, you have situations in which the agency achieved its foreign policy accomplishment, the requirement to do something, and then over the ensuing years, the failure to follow up from the foreign policy domain led to some serious consequences down the road. Now let me start with a kind of a quick brush through a number of cases that will illustrate some of the dynamics I've been talking about. This is the first program we rolled out way back in 1948, an effort to keep Italy from falling under communist domination through peaceful processes. That is, the communists win an election, and the fear is when that happens, no more elections. And looking not too far away at Czechoslovakia at this time, we do have an example of exactly that happening, a peaceful coup that took over the government and its communist run until the fall of the Soviet Empire decades later. We were not going to allow that to happen in Italy, of all places. And so we move in, again, presidential authorization for CIA to move in and conduct a variety of political action techniques that became sort of a playbook as we moved around the world to other countries, not always successfully, because they weren't like Italy. They weren't Western parliamentary democracies. So trying to use these tactics, say in Vietnam, to prop up an illegitimate government, just didn't work. In other cases, as you'll see, it did. More strategically is a cultural offensive, a hearts and minds offensive, to foil efforts by communist governments to win over people's hearts and minds to Marxism. The Soviets, starting way back with the Comintern, soon after the Bolshevik Revolution, had established a whole variety of influence organizations around the world, unofficial but official. What these were doing was propagating Marxism and promoting Soviet foreign policy goals, trying to win hearts and minds in vulnerable populations like Western intellectuals and students and labor unions, agricultural organizations and such. We established a counter-front organization apparatus, a massive one, that spent dozens of millions of dollars over the years to not just combat what the Soviets were doing, but to promote Western values in those same target populations. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty are two well-known examples, the Congress of Cultural Freedom, the book program, a variety of other initiatives around the world. We had counterpart organizations in Asia doing the same thing through the Asia Foundation, which is acknowledged, and you can read about it in some of our documents. That was the whole point. Now later on, this was exposed in 1967, the so-called Ramparts scandal, and the whole apparatus crashes in a very short period of time and becomes a bit of a scandal. The idea that we are manipulating National Student Association operatives, or corrupting publications, or forcing publishers to print books that are pro-American and such. These are myths that have been perpetuated in some of the literature. But the program did end, and it's never been replicated since. Measures of effectiveness, hard to pin down. We do know anecdotally from people after the fact. They said they read this stuff, they listened to this stuff, they went to the conferences, they went to the art exhibits, they came away with a better appreciation of the vitality of Western culture and the fact that a Marxist society is really intellectually stultifying, not liberating. That was kind of the whole premise of the program. As we're moving out into the third world during the era of decolonization, we run into a lot of trouble because some of the situations that we confronted, often on very short notice, were not congenial to the types of capabilities we had. In particular, some of the autocratic regimes in the third world that retained popular support either through intimidation or apathy, or generally people said, "You're fine, we can live with you." And they retained control of their military and security forces. We couldn't budge them. So that's why Sukarno didn't go. That's why Castro didn't go, and a few others as well. We had more success in Iran and Guatemala, but I think we learned the wrong lessons from those early and relatively easy successes. And I would argue, too, that those are examples whereby you can see, I think, the validity of my earlier point that the covert action worked, but the long-term effect of it was not followed up by foreign policy, and you had some serious consequences ensuing. Greg Treverton, one of our best-known scholars of intelligence and covert action, I'd encourage you to read his works if you haven't already, points out the misconception that both CIA and the US policy community got from these early programs, that this was an easy thing to do. You lay it in fast, it works pretty cheap and easy, US hand is hidden, and you get away with a quick victory. And we got spoiled. We also ignored covert action failures in other countries like Indonesia, China, Cuba, and consequently came away feeling a little bit too giddy about prospects for using covert action. This is a lesson we should have learned. And this goes back to some of those best practices I talked about earlier on, which is that covert action should be used very precisely in appropriate targets where it can really make a difference. It did so in Iran, as Ray Klein, who used to run our analytic directorate, said, a unique case of supplying just the right amount of push in just the right way, at the right time, with the right people, and that's why it worked. It almost failed, but because our head operative in the field, Kermit Roosevelt, had the wherewithal to come up on the fly with new tactics and new techniques. He was able to very quickly adapt to imminent failure and pull something off that was about to crash around him. So that's what we should have learned, that right there we had the right plug and play, and you don't always find that in other operational environments. For example, Cuba, trying to take the same operational package that worked in Guatemala and then 7 years later move it into Cuba, and it's a total disaster. To this day, the Bay of Pigs remains the biggest covert action failure the agency has had, and for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is not adapting a covert set of tools to a quite different operational environment. And it had serious consequences for the agency. Our director, Alan Dulles, is fired. He's replaced by John McCone, who is charged with never letting something like this happen again. And he does a good job of that. During his 39 years as director, we didn't have any more covert action fiascos like this. Also, in another part of the world, Vietnam, it has a serious impact on CIA activity, where in the early 1960s we had been running, as you'll see, some fairly effective pacification programs using paramilitary forces, local paramilitaries. These are all taken away from us under a program called Switchback, and suddenly now they're all run by US Special Forces. The problem there is that they become adjuncts to the conventional war, which really undermines their effectiveness because they were never intended to be sideshows to a big war. They were intended to function on their own for their own purposes. And they very quickly wind up becoming ineffective. Now here's an example where you can get it right. You have here also a very, I think, underappreciated story of success. In the Philippines, we have a dual challenge. One is suppressing a communist-inspired insurgency, the Hukbalahap rebellion. Now this isn't being manipulated by the Chinese or the Russians. This is a homegrown Maoist uprising. And it threatens to destabilize the government. So we have to first work with the Filipino military and security services to suppress that insurgency, to maintain political stability so a reasonably free and fair election can be held to establish a functioning democracy. And what we have working for us is an ideal ally, Ramon Magsaysay, the Minister of Defense. He is highly popular, clean of corruption, willing to work with us to advance his political interests. All sorts of best practices come into play here in this case study. And the outcome is very good. Magsaysay wins the election and establishes a functioning democracy for the rest of his life, which regrettably was relatively short. He died in an airplane accident several years after he took power. Sorry to say, the Philippines soon after then slid into autocracy under Ferdinand Marcos, but people power emerged under Cory Aquino, and Marcos is pushed out. And you do have a functioning democracy there again. It's getting a little sketchy now under Duterte, but I think it will last. And so we should be able to look back on this as really a long-term success, at least in the Philippines. The problem is moving it into an operational environment where it didn't quite pertain, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Let me talk here about a recently acknowledged program. That is, 5 years ago, we released as much documentation as we could about a highly successful program in the Congo that is an illustration of a number of our best practices, but also that foreign policy handoff that leads to a long-term disaster. The goal here is to prevent the Congo, which is an enormously large country. It's as big as the eastern United States. It's strategically located and has a lot of valuable resources that the Soviets are hoping to get their hands on. Also, the Belgian colonialists left the Congolese with next to nothing. They were rapacious colonists. You have no civic infrastructure, no experienced political class, and the country risks falling apart because, like so many third world countries, it's artificial. It's some geopolitical cartographers creating a nation on a map, and it's starting to fall apart through secessionist rebellions. We can't let this happen, say our foreign policy leaders. CIA, go bail us out. So in conjunction with the UN, which is running peacekeeping operations to help keep the country together, the CIA moves in a multi-phase covert action involving political action to build a democratic governing group, propaganda to degrade the popularity of communists and leftists, and paramilitary assistance to the government to help it suppress the insurgencies or secessionist rebellions, some of which are getting foreign aid from the Soviets, the Chinese, and the Cubans. Now, this is all working reasonably well, but we're still having trouble building that governing group, which is beset with infighting. And eventually, the head of the military, Joseph Mobutu, moves in, pushes everybody aside, and takes over the government in a peaceful coup. Our foreign policy leaders say that's not really what we wanted, at least in the way it came about. We would have preferred this to develop through parliamentary means, but we'll live with the consequences. At least we have this national leader who's strong enough to keep the country together. And at that point, the agency's covert program starts to diminish as it pulls out assets and reduces the paramilitary assistance to the government. And by 1968, CIA's covert action is ended. As I say, we're still there doing some espionage to make sure we're in touch with what's going on, but we're not there to help keep the country together. The US government is happy with Mobutu. And as long as he remains a US ally, decidedly anti-communist, votes our way in the United Nations, and helps us out in a few other foreign policy and covert initiatives in Africa, we're sweet on him. But look what he's doing to his country. He's destroying it. But our foreign policy leaders don't really care. They have other interests, or they've just forgotten about the Congo. And that's often the case with this foreign policy handoff. Other issues intrude. Administrations come in with different world views. They're not interested in certain issues. Those issues are just overtaken by events. Other things become prominent. And the foreign policy achievement of the covert action does not stick. And I think you have here in the Congo a classic example of that, of a covert action success and a foreign policy debacle over the ensuing 30 years. Real quickly in Vietnam, a highly mixed record. And you can read all about this in our declassified histories. One of my contract historians has written the definitive account of CIA in Vietnam, Thomas Ahern. It's all available on cia.gov. And what he describes is a very difficult situation, made more difficult by our attempt to import successful methods from countries where they worked into a country where they don't work and probably can't work. It's very hard to establish the legitimacy of a government that takes power illegitimately, and one that seems almost willfully unwilling to reform itself to make itself legitimate and popular. That's the problem with No Dinh Diem. He simply will not get rid of the oligarchy that was governing the country with him to expand its popularity amongst the peasantry, where the Viet Cong were making, as you know, major inroads. Our pacification programs work in a kind of an oil spot fashion. They're good here, they're good here, they're good here, but they don't really expand too far beyond the immediate operational environment. We have a handful of very good stories to tell here, but overall, they didn't work as broadly, as strategically as we would have liked. We tried some infiltration operations into the north to link up supposedly with opposition elements. We thought they were there the way they were in occupied France and occupied the Netherlands and occupied Norway back in World War II, but it's not the same operational environment. So again, we're taking a method from one locale, trying to transport it into another where the circumstances simply don't pertain, and the programs are absolute disasters. We lost dozens and dozens of agents, needlessly I would contend, by sending them in regularly into the north, dropping them into a security environment where they would immediately be caught, or even worse, turned back against us. A complete hash. And when the military took it over in 1964, it got bigger, but absolutely no better, and thankfully was canceled in 1968. At that point, it's replaced not with something we're doing in the north, but by something we're doing in the south, the Phoenix program, a very misunderstood program. I don't have the time to get into all the details. I can just tell you right here that it was highly effective in destroying the Viet Cong infrastructure in the South. And if you look at the difference between the Tet Offensive in '68 and the Easter Offensive in '72, you'll see why. The Tet Offensive is principally Viet Cong with some conventional Northern Army, Vietnam Army assistance. The Easter Offensive is just the opposite. It's overwhelmingly a conventional attack because there isn't any infrastructure in the South left really to support it. And throughout these programs, we are suffering from a lot of counterintelligence ineptitude, allowing infiltrations, playbacks, turnovers of agents to the other side, a lot of it having to do with the fact that we were depending on South Vietnamese liaison to provide us with assets and with linguists. And that's always been a big vulnerability of ours, is relying on locals to do our translation, our document exploitation, our agent debriefs, things like that. Those individuals can sometimes be planted on us, and in other cases they can be identified and turned back against us or intimidated in some fashion. You have to have your own homegrown language capabilities to keep your covert action secure. It took us a long time to learn that lesson. And we're doing a lot better at it than we were in the past, but it remains a persistent issue. Right next door, we have a very successful program, running a paramilitary program with 50,000 proxies, the Hmong principally in Laos. The idea here is keep Laos neutral under the Geneva Accords. And because of those accords, we can't go in militarily. The accords said no conventional forces may remain in Laos. Well, guess who left and guess who stayed? We left, they stayed. And they are trying to destabilize the government and turn it into a North Vietnamese satellite, in effect. So the idea here is send in CIA, build a resistance force that can protect the neutrality of Laos. And it does so till 1975, when we pull out of the region and the dominoes start to fall. And it's an excellent case study about how to run a major paramilitary program. And I would encourage you again to read Tom Ahern's study of this, which has been declassified and is out on CIA.gov. Another recently acknowledged program involves what used to be known as British Guiana. This is a soon-to-be independent British colony with a functioning parliamentary democracy. And the idea here is that we do not want, the US government, I should say, does not want the election to bring into power a left-wing nationalist with communist sympathies and a communist wife. This is Chedi Jagan, who was the prime minister at the time the program is hatched. And with the election coming up, he potentially would be head of the newly independent government. The British don't like the idea either and let us kind of carry the ball for them. Now, in this case, we have a country with a functioning parliamentary democracy. So what we can do, in effect, is open up the political action playbook that we were using in Europe very successfully and apply it here. And it worked. We have the same kinds of techniques that we had used in Europe quite ably, and they do secure the election of the pro-West, pro-US coalition under Forbes-Burnham. But here's a classic example of you don't always get what you wish for. Forbes-Burnham is no sooner in power than he turns entirely against us and starts cozying up to the Soviets, the Chinese, and of all countries, North Korea. And we're just scratching our heads. Where did this come from? Now, we know that certain of our analysts had suggested Burnham was not a stable, reliable ally. But in this particular situation, he was the one we decided to back. And we suffered some of the consequences of his very marked change of heart. Eventually, we disabused ourselves of him, and by early 1971 or so, we have cut ties with him completely. So this is an odd case of a covert action success leading to entirely unintended consequences, well worth studying. Chile remains probably our most controversial covert action ever. It was one of the handful of undemocratic, arguably, covert actions that were disclosed during the Church Committee hearings, and remains vibrant in the minds of a variety of human rights activists and left-wingers and critics of U.S. foreign policy, because it sort of shows, if you accept that argument, the idea that covert action is fundamentally undemocratic and very often leads to undemocratic consequences, i.e. Allende's removal from power and replacement by a brutal junta. Well, let's backtrack and see what's really going on here. For starters, it wasn't anything new for the agency. The agency had been called into Chile in '58 and '64 to intervene in the elections and support center-right or center-conservative parties. The difference here is that in 1970, Salvador Allende, who had been in those previous two elections, is now getting all sorts of support from Castro, and we now know from KGB archives, he was deemed a Soviet asset. And he has pledged to do some things that U.S. corporations don't like. Now, they tried to pressure the CIA into pushing the Nixon administration into launching covert action. The CIA said, go away, we don't take orders from U.S. corporations. Interestingly, John McCone was on the board of directors of one of those corporations that was pressuring the Nixon administration and the CIA. Finally, and here's why the covert action failed so miserably, the Nixon administration finally gets concerned about what's going on there in the summer of 1970, with the first election to be held in September. Now remember what I said earlier, covert action cannot be brought in at the last minute to bail you out of an unpleasant situation. This is exactly what happened here. CIA is ordered into Chile to prevent Allende from winning that election, or taking power if he does win the election. And so the Nixon administration orders CIA to concoct a two-part program. One is negative political action. We are not supporting a candidate, so we don't have any positively sought outcome. We are just trying to prevent something from happening. That's not a good covert action practice. Secondly, in extremis, if Allende seems to be winning the election or has won the election, a military coup will be launched. Well, for starters, you can't do either of these things on the fly very quickly. And that's one reason why the program crashed ultimately. And Allende was able to take office through constitutional means. CIA is kept in the country to assist in the destabilization of the regime, which does occur in 1973 when a coup is launched, something we didn't have warning of and weren't behind, contrary to a lot of public literature. And Allende commits suicide before he is captured by the coup plotters. Now, when this is all exposed in 1975 and 6 by the Church Committee, along with a small number of other undemocratic covert actions, this creates the general image of covert action as being undemocratic. I'll show you at the end of my remarks something quite different. When all of this blows up in the mid-1970s, major changes occur in the whole political environment of covert action. We are banned from doing certain things, the budget is cut, the finding process is established, oversight becomes very intrusive. We, to this day, spend more of our time in congressional interaction about covert action than anything else we do. And as I mentioned earlier, the covert action activities are cut way, way back. In comes a reformist administration that ostensibly is never going to let any of this kind of sordid stuff happen again. That's the Carter administration. Well, I told you that eventually they get around to realizing that they might need to do some of that sordid stuff because the world changed under their feet in 1979 with the Sandinista takeover and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. That big program was ultimately a major success and one of the reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed, because it totally lost any legitimacy it might have had with the people of the USSR, along with a lot of other things that you're probably aware of, the economic decline, the conflicts among the ruling entities, and other foreign policy setbacks as well. But the CIA's support to the Mujahideen, which is only partially correctly depicted in the book and movie Charlie Wilson's War, but I nonetheless would commend both of them to you for an insight into a certain part of the program, a big success, one of our major successes at the end of the Cold War. This is the program with which the Reagan administration is identified very closely, along with Nicaragua. What I would like to say about Nicaragua is please get it out of your minds that the covert program consists of the Iran-Contra scandal. That was a illegal, regrettable sideshow by some rogue elements at the National Security Council and at CIA, and they all suffered legal penalties for violating the law. The reason that all came about, however, was because of inconsistent funding from Congress. And though the Reagan administration should not, or those elements of the Reagan administration should not have come up with that legal end run, nonetheless, it's a reality that the program was relatively ineffective until 1986, when Congress opened up the funding spigot for good. Well, what was this all about? It was an effort to force the Sandinista government to live up to its ideals. Remember, it took power by overthrowing a brutal regime led by Anastasio Somoza. They come into power saying, we're for the people, we're a freedom-loving regime, but they were anything but. The Reagan administration, which is dedicated to winning the Cold War, finds an opportunity here and launches a dual political paramilitary attack on the Sandinista regime. It supports the political ambitions of Nicaraguan oppositionists through non-lethal assistance, and it supports the paramilitary activities of the Contras through lethal assistance. And by 1988, the newly rejuvenated Contras have fought the Sandinista army to a stalemate on the battlefield. And the government says, we better come up with some kind of negotiated settlement here or we might get toppled. And that's why the 1990 election occurred. And to practically everybody's surprise, not the least of which CIA's, the Contras won. Violeta Chamorro, the widow of one of the Contra leaders, since deceased, wins. And you do have established in Nicaragua a functioning democracy. Ironically, guess who's voted into power in the early 2010s through the free and open democracy that the CIA had helped set up? Daniel Ortega, the guy we were trying to get out of power back here during the 1980s. Again, you don't always get what you wish for, but our basic point was we wanted to establish an open political system and did. Okay, here's my last broad point. CIA, covert action, and democracy, not a contradiction in terms. Here are two perspectives, one from Henry Kissinger and one from Philip Agee again. These two observations cannot be reconciled by facts. There's no way that these two contradictory conclusions can both survive an empirical test. And that's what we're going to do for the rest of my presentation. Now I'd like you to imagine a spectrum starting on one side with very pro-democracy covert actions, and then eliding through to the other side of the spectrum where ones that are pretty blatantly anti or undemocratic. And then you have this interesting middle ground where a lot of the controversy develops about this general point. And these involve, as you'll see, certain countries around the world that don't seem like democratic systems, but are under serious threat from totalitarian systems. So let me build on this a bit. The most pro-democratic covert actions would be these. The ones that are intended to get rid of a dictatorship and replace it with democratic elements. No one can argue that that's not pro-democratic. Or, inside a dictatorship, supporting democratic elements in the hope that someday they might liberate their country from that authoritarian system. Or thirdly, a functioning democracy that is under threat from undemocratic subversive elements, often assisted by outside actors like the Soviet Union or Communist China. So those are over on one end of the spectrum. Then you move toward the center. And here you're dealing with a variety of situations in which the civic culture, the social society, the cultural interaction within this community or nation is not what we would call democratic. We're talking about highly traditionalist societies with tribal elements or religious elements that don't really practice democracy in the sense that we think of it. But they do have their own sense of what they want to be. They don't want to be controlled by outsiders, and we don't want them to be controlled by outsiders. So if you think, for example, of the Afghan Mujahideen, or the Tibetan secessionists, or the Hmong in Laos, or a number of our other third world proxies, if you want to call them that. This isn't France and Italy and Spain and a Western democracy, but it is an environment in which we want them to live the way they want to live and not have Moscow or Beijing dictating to them how they shall live. In other words, it's a forum for Cold War combat. So we're trying to protect their right to live their lives in a sense of popular sovereignty. And as they say, in some cases, these really aren't systems that share our values, but we certainly don't want them to be forced into being something else under communist rule. And then you have, at the other end of the scale, the undemocratic or less democratic, where you have us intervening in a democracy, manipulating the system to get our desired outcome. Or you have a coup plot, or an assassination plot, which we did hatch a few times in the late 50s, early 60s, and then thankfully got out of the business because it never worked. Those are pretty undemocratic. Taking a leader, especially one who is either popularly elected or popularly supported, and just saying, get out of power any way possible, just so we can put in somebody we like. Those, I think, we would all argue, are undemocratic. So, using our sample set, those acknowledged covert actions that I've given you earlier, and I can't hold up my right hand and swear to this, they're kind of busy here, but you have to trust me on this. All of the hundreds of covert actions that I've studied that have not been acknowledged fit this empirical test. So now that you're all excited for what I'm going to click on next, here it is. 7 out of 8 fall into those first two categories of clearly pro-democratic or working with that hard set of actors, protecting them from totalitarianism so they can live their lives the way they choose. And if you go through this list, you'll see what I'm talking about. The ones that are clearly pro-democratic, and the ones in which we had to work with opportunistic allies, such as in Iraq, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, and others, people who weren't necessarily trying to become Western-style Democrats, but our shared interest was we don't want them to be run by communist regimes. So 7 out of 8 of that sample set, and again, of all the ones that aren't acknowledged, fit this category. Now, we have far fewer long-term successes in this category, in part because the foreign policy follow-up did not necessarily protect the accomplishments that we had. And in a couple of cases, our long-term successes definitely don't qualify as pro-democratic. Conversely, only 1 out of 8 of the sample set fall into what arguably are undemocratic covert actions. Ones in which we executed a coup against a popularly elected leader, or severely manipulated the system to corrupt it and achieve a desired outcome, as in these cases. Now, some of these, you might say, don't quite fit the undemocratic category. For example, if we go into a functioning democracy and we use the democratic system to achieve a foreign policy outcome, is that undemocratic? Just because we were trying to get rid of a popularly elected leader. Some people say, yes, that is bad influence in a functioning system. Others would say, well, what's the difference between what we did here, getting a government out of power, and what we did in Italy, protecting a government in power? But that could become sort of an academic exercise. I'm looking here at the popular perceptions. Most people think that Iran, Guatemala, and others were undemocratic. I'd also point out that these are the ones, with this exception, because it wasn't admitted yet, those are the ones the Church Committee exposed. And for years and years, those were the only ones that people really talked about, because in part they were the only ones that had been acknowledged. Had more information been released over the years, or at that time, about the totality of covert action, I think you would have had a much different public perception about what really goes on in covert action programs. For example, hardly anybody writes about the book program, a decades-long effort to infiltrate ideas about Western democracy and its values, not in a propagandistic sense, but simply objective treatments of it, through a covert process, bringing books into the Soviet Union through smugglers, through legal travelers, having book fairs on the outside where traveling Soviets could see the books, read the books, take them back home. This went on for decades and decades and has been evaluated as quite successful. But you won't find much literature about it on the outside. But you'll find lots of books about some of those others. And I'll finish up with one attempt to kind of evaluate why this skewed perception. One reason is not a lot of people know about many of those acknowledged programs. If you go to a typical history book about US foreign policy, and you go to the index, and if you find an entry about CIA, most likely what you're going to find are 3 or 4 sub-entries about some of those undemocratic programs, because that's just kind of what keeps getting circulated around. What I'd suggest is the reason for the misconceptions has something to do with the overall impact of these programs. By impact, I mean two things. One is geopolitical impact. Did the programs make a big difference in the way the world works? So, for example, I would say the Iran program had a huge impact, because had Iran gone in a certain direction, say had the Communist Party of Iran taken over the government, that would have been a major impact. But also the fact that over the years the Shah corrupted his leadership through authoritarian measures and allowed a secular and religious opposition to gradually build and eventually force him out of power. That's obviously had a major impact in world events. In some other cases, the high impact programs are more from the public perception standpoint. What people think about covert action often derives from these very programs. And that's why you have, instead of 7 out of 8, you now are down to just over 3 out of 4. And where you had 1 out of 8, you're approaching 25%. So my suggestion here is that the way to deal with this imbalance of perception is to learn more about covert action programs through the fact that so many have been acknowledged, books have been written about some of them, documentation is available, and it's all good fodder for research by you students and scholars. With that, I'll stop my remarks and take a handful of questions